Swadikap. Good morning from Bangkok, Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, the Institute of Security and International Studies in downtown Bangkok. And first, let me welcome everyone to our webinar. We've been having a series, but today it's very much my pleasure to introduce a book launch. And then around this book launch, we'll have a discussion. And the book is by Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S Southeast Asia Strategy. I know that now, over the past 10 days, 12 days, we have been preoccupied and I think concerned with the Russia's war in Ukraine. And Ukraine is very much embattled and beleaguered. And this has understandably consumed global attention, including from the U.S. and Washington and European Union and NATO countries and also Asian countries and beyond. But today we're going to include that discussion. I think a little bit, is relevant because the U.S. has a limited appetite and resources to engage with the rest of the world, with Asia, Indo-Pacific, but also now with the Russia's war in Ukraine. The big question is, is the Atlantic back? There's been a lot of talk about the Pacific presidency going back to President Barack Obama. There was a free and open Indo-Pacific under President Donald Trump, and now the Indo-Pacific strategy under President Biden, Joe Biden. But now Russia is back at it with the aggression in Ukraine. So, the question is the Atlantic Alliance, is that back front and center? Is that front and center again? And if so, what would be the consequences and implications for Southeast Asia? I'm just going to give the author a chance now. This is a very timely book coming out at this time. I think there's a U.S. ASEAN Summit coming up, and the ASEAN related summits later this year. So it's a timely book, and then I think we have the pleasure to launch it. Elusive Balances. And it talks about U.S. and Southeast Asia in perspective, not just what we're seeing in the news, but also going back to even the Vietnam era, the Vietnam War era. So perhaps I invite Dr. Prashanth a little bit. Would you please give us a little bit of a synopsis of your book, and in the light of current events, how might these events also impinge on your main arguments in the book, Dr. Prashanth?
Great, thank you, Titinan, and thank you, Van, as well for joining, and thank you everyone who's joining us for this discussion. I realize this is on the one hand, as Titinan was saying, this couldn't have been better timed in terms of the discussion, because essentially the argument of the book, Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy, is precisely about this issue of the commitment challenge that the United States faces in Southeast Asia, which is, in essence, as Titinan summarized it, multiple U.S. administrations have talked about the United States increasing its commitment to Asia and Southeast Asia more specifically over the past few years. And obviously, we've seen some continuity and some change under the Trump administration, for example. That commitment looked very different from what it looked like under the Obama administration and then the George W. Bush administration and then the Clinton administration and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there has been a recognition that the United States' interest and stakes are growing in Asia, and the United States needs to focus there. But the reality, obviously, is that the United States, as the United States does that, there's various domestic issues that all U.S. administrations needs to face, and also other global and regional challenges. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an excellent example of that lies outside of Asia. China, North Korea, various other crises and challenges, including those that Van has written about extensively, are on the other hand, things that the U.S. policymakers need to overcome as well. So this timing for the argument, essentially the big question is, we're seeing the Biden administration sort of roll out its Indo-Pacific strategy, various documents that initially were supposed to come out last year but were postponed the Indo-Pacific strategy that came out last month. There's supposed to be a national defense strategy. There's a China strategy. There's a U.S. ASEAN Summit that Titinan referred to in the introduction that's supposed to be held now, I think March 28 to 29. That was supposed to be held earlier, but it was postponed for various reasons, including scheduling. So all of these things are happening on the one hand in U.S. policy, but on the other hand, you have a series of developments that are interfering with that, and the top of mind, obviously, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so the essential question is the United States able to, as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time? And that's obviously something which US policymakers like to say that they can do, but the reality is there's significant trade-offs when it comes to resources, bandwidth, personnel, and so on and so forth. Now, where the book sort of applies is that this is actually not a new debate. In fact, in every single administration since the post-Vietnam War period in Southeast Asia, the last half century, US policymakers have had to confront this dilemma. We saw this when the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam and at the same time was trying to argue that it was actually increasing its commitment to Southeast Asia, but in a different way. And US businesses were trying to actually increase their commitment. We saw the US ASEAN Business Council, for example, try to take a more sort of forward-leaning position on the business side. This was a similar case under the George W. Bush administration, right? Where the Bush administration was initially started out saying that it wanted to focus squarely on China and strategic competition. Very familiar argument that we heard similarly under the Trump administration and then now in the Biden administration. The Bush administration started from the same place, but the September 11 attacks then led the Bush administration to focus a little bit more on the Middle East. They tried to focus a little bit more on Southeast Asia in the second term, but that all got lost in the sort of narrative generally, which is the United States was focused more on the Middle East than it was focused on Asia. And in the Obama administration, the Obama administration focused in an unprecedented level in terms of its sort of pivot or rebalance to Asia, but also more importantly in Southeast Asia, where you saw a lot of presidential level commitment to Southeast Asia. And I recall, a lot of U.S. diplomats and Southeast Asian diplomats essentially asking the same question, which is, this is great, but how long can it last? And have we essentially reached peak U.S. Southeast Asia commitment? Is this as good as it gets, essentially? And subsequently, we saw resource constraints that were affecting the Obama administration, and that carried on into where we are now with the Biden administration. So this is not new. The question essentially where the book sort of starts is, why do we keep seeing the same question essentially being posed, which is, why is it so difficult for US administrations, multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, to increase their commitment to Southeast Asia and then sustain it over time? And why do we keep hearing about challenges with respect to US commitment? And essentially, the book's main argument is that this doesn't have to do with the fact that US policymakers don't understand that this is an issue. I think they well understand this. This is a debate that essentially has been going on for decades. I don't think that this is a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of comprehension. I also think this is not just a case of, I think some arguments sometimes are made in a very sort of, offhand fashion that, Southeast Asia is just a really difficult region to engage with. It's too diverse. Or, Southeast Asian countries are really tough graders, right? No matter what the United States does, they're going to sort of grade the United States down on certain aspects rather than other areas. I don't think that's the case. I think it has to do largely with, and this is the book's main argument, it has to do with how US policymakers have to balance between their perceptions and understandings of shifts in power, shifts in threats, and the ability to mobilize resources. It's very difficult to do all three at the same time, and that is the essence of the US commitment challenge in Southeast Asia. So that's the essence of the book's argument. As Titinan said, it goes through 4 episodes of US commitment in Southeast Asia over the past 50 years. It starts off with the sort of post-Vietnam period in US policy, and all 4 of these cases don't really look at one specific administration. They look at periods of time, because one of the essential parts of the argument is that this doesn't really have to do with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's really a common set of structural challenges that both parties face. So the post-Vietnam period is an extremely interesting one because it looks at a period where the U.S. was essentially contracting or retrenching in terms of its overall U.S. Asia policy, but U.S. officials were essentially trying to make the argument that no, the United States actually was changing the shape of its commitment. If you looked at, maybe security commitments were being retrenched, but the United States was involved more economically. There were a range of diplomatic visits, and a lot of these documents are essentially declassified now. So you can actually go ahead and read, and the book includes a lot of significant detail about U.S. officials from the State Department who are going through regional capitals and seeing how anxious Southeast Asian countries were, that the United States were essentially retrenching from Southeast Asia. But when those cables came back and they came over to the White House and policymakers in Washington, there was a tendency to understate the vulnerabilities that Southeast Asian countries are making in the sense of, actually the regional security environment in Southeast Asia is quite benign. These fears are actually being exaggerated and so on and so forth. So this theme of, what exactly is happening with respect to US power and capabilities versus the perceptions of US policymakers, and essentially whose perceptions is Washington paying attention to, is very palpable in the post Vietnam War period. The second case looks at the post-Cold War period, and this is a very interesting period because you have essentially a shift away from the bipolar system that characterized U.S. policy from essentially the post-World War II period up to the end of the Cold War. So although there's some adjustments in that period as well towards the latter part of the Cold War that affect that as well. And one of the interesting things that we find in the post-Cold War period is there's a lot of similarities to some of the conversations that we're having now. I mean, the sort of convergence of traditional security threats and non-traditional security threats, as we sort of initially talked about it in the framing, the U.S. involvement in multilateral organizations, the U.S. involvement in the Clinton administration's foray into APEC, for example, as an institution, trying to get involved more in multilateral institutions based on what ASEAN was doing, coming up with new institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum. The United States was just beginning to get acclimatized to this balance between bilateral institutions and regional institutions. And that was very much a theme during the period. But at the same time, we also saw a lot of challenges in US policy, including on democracy and human rights, where we see similar challenges here today. And on the one hand, the United States was trying to make the case for Southeast Asian countries to expedite conversations around democracy and human rights. But as Titina notes, we're seeing this with respect to the Biden administration and its Democracy Summit, where we have the Biden administration talking about the United States trying to come up with a more forward-leaning approach to democracy and human rights. But in Southeast Asia, we're seeing a conversation around either regression of democracy in the aggregate, or a conversation around the discrepancy and the divide between democracy and governance. So on the one hand, there's agreement about the need to progress on things like transparency and corruption and so on and so forth. But in terms of regime type, depending on which country you're talking about, it's a very different conversation. And so that aggregate sort of conversation about democracy versus the sort of more specific conversation about governance is something that is affecting U.S. Southeast Asia relations today. I won't sort of go into too much about the Bush administration because that's a very familiar story, which, as I talked about earlier, the Bush administration started essentially when they came into office. A lot of the personnel in the Bush administration, and when I interviewed these individuals and administration officials, they essentially, were saying the same thing. U.S. China competition was not something that the Bush administration didn't consider. This was very much at the forefront of their minds. But once September 11 hit, the focus understandably shifted to terrorism. And despite the adjustments that were made in the second part of the Bush administration, where in fact the Bush administration tried to organize a U.S. ASEAN summit, but for issues of various considerations, including Myanmar, they weren't able to do that. There were a lot of economic initiatives, including the conclusion of the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement under the Bush administration, that were quite significant. But if you look at the public commentary about the Bush administration's legacy in Southeast Asia, that's perhaps a footnote relative to the overriding narrative about what happened in the Bush administration in Southeast Asia, which is that it was too narrowly framed around the issue of terrorism, and it ended up being very security focused relative to, say, the diplomacy component, where you had officials within the Bush administration not attend ASEAN fora regularly, and so on and so forth, right? So that was where we sort of left it off in the Bush administration. And the Obama administration, we saw, as I said, the sort of rebalance, and the rebalance within the rebalance, a lot of focus on Southeast Asia, diplomatically, economically, sort of the foray into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But as we all know, towards the end of the Obama administration in the second term, there were summits that were held, still continuation of the diplomatic commitment, but a lot of the initial promises, whether it was on commitment on issues like the South China Sea, commitment on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, were not realized. And that was something that's not unique to the Obama administration, as we found out in the Trump administration, that continued the withdrawal of the United States from the TPP, and so on and so forth. So these aspects of the argument, continue to sort of stand the test of time if you look at the last 50 years, which brings us to where we are with the Biden administration today. And I want to just say a few words by way of framing. I know we'll sort of get into it a little bit in the conversation. I think if you look at the four cases of changes in U.S. commitment over time in the last 50 years, you do see a series of trends that are really important for us to consider with respect to the Biden administration. The first is, irrespective of where an administration starts with respect to what it says about U.S. commitment, there is a trend across all four of these cases of underperforming commitment levels and really near persistent commitment imbalances. So whether we're talking about the balance between how much the US invests in the security landscape versus economics, whether we talk about how much the US talks about human rights versus how it focuses on its interests, whether we talk about the balance between bilateral institutions and multilateral institutions, it's very difficult actually to find an administration that gets the balance right on all 4 or 5 of these aspects. It's almost impossible for these administrations to do, because they have to calibrate between power, threats, and resources to do it at the same time. So that's one thing that is really important. I would say the second thing that's really important as we consider what the Biden administration is doing is that there are facts in terms of how power is shifting, in terms of how much resources the US has, but then there's also perceptions. And there's really big divides in terms of how policymakers perceive what is actually happening. I mean, a good example of that is you can look across the past 3 administrations. All 3 of them have had very different conceptions about whether we're living in a unipolar world, a bipolar world, or a multipolar world, right? And we can agree that capabilities have increased, power has sort of shifted over time, but in reality, you shouldn't have every new administration coming to the fore and having a different perception of what the international system actually is giving us, in terms of whether it's a more unipolar one, a bipolar one, or a multipolar one. And I think that sort of difference between perception and reality really clouds all of the administrations that we're talking about. And then the final thing I'll say is with respect to resources. There is a sense in general that when we're talking about commitment, and the book really goes into commitment from a variety of perspectives, right? Not just security commitment. It looks at economic commitment, it looks at diplomatic commitment, it looks at people-to-people ties. And when you look at commitment changes vary depending on which aspect of commitment you're looking at. So when we look at alliances and partnerships, those tend to be very sticky. So irrespective of what an administration would do, it's very difficult for an administration to say withdraw from a US treaty alliance, right? Or withdraw from a partnership commitment. But on the other hand, it's very easy for an administration to not follow through on diplomatic commitments, right? It's very hard for an administration to come up with new economic commitments, because that requires approval from Congress. US economic policy, as we all know, is very divided. You have to get the buy-in of Congress, you have to get the buy-in of the US Trade Representative, U.S. commerce, and so on and so forth. So, and U.S. commitment economically also depends not just on the U.S. government, it depends on U.S. businesses and the private sector as well. So, depending on what aspect of commitment you're talking about, it's very important to sort of be very specific about what aspect we're sort of dealing with here. That can, make a very big difference in terms of what administrations are doing. But that being said, I think we can say a few things about what the Biden administration sees before it. I think, the Biden administration faces a very challenging context where there is a real sense. I think if you look at, everything from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies surveys of elites to the Pew surveys, there is a sense that there is a power shift away from the United States and towards China. And there is a sense very much here in Washington that there's a very heightened sense of threat perception from China and the US position. I don't think there's a clear sense of what to do about it, but I think there's a very clear sense that there's a sort of sense of increased threat from China. But there's also real limitations on what the United States can do about it. There's huge resource constraints coming out from COVID-19 to political polarization in the US domestic context that makes it very complicated for Washington to fashion a response that is going to be across the board and very comprehensive. So not just security commitments, because the Pentagon is very well resourced, but what is the United States going to do on the economic side? What is the United States going to do on the diplomatic side? It's very difficult to get all of those balances right. So considering that very significant challenge that the Biden administration faces, I would say, they've made quite an impressive start in Southeast Asia. I think they've made it very clear that levels of commitment have been raised with respect to strategic and comprehensive partnerships with Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam. In the case of Indonesia, for example, the U.S. Indonesia strategic partnership under the Obama administration was essentially suspended under the Trump administration. There weren't a lot of significant inroads there. And so that had to be restarted and relaunched by Anthony Blinken last year. And so we're seeing some increasing traction around that. Kamala Harris paid a visit to the region where she essentially talked about the U.S. Singapore strategic partnership and the U.S. Vietnam comprehensive partnership. What can they sort of look to improve in that sense? There was a lot of new cooperation, a new sort of regional center for the CDC that was established in Vietnam, cooperation on supply chains and outer space with Singapore. So a lot of good, interesting aspects of cooperation. The U.S. ASEAN Summit, if it takes place, is going to be a very significant first in U.S. ASEAN relations. It's going to be the first U.S. ASEAN Summit of its kind that's held in Washington, D.C. The one that was held under the Obama administration was held in Sunnyland. So this is going to be an elevation in that sense as well. So a lot of good things that are happening under the Biden administration. That being said, I think there are a lot of structural challenges that remain. And again, that's really the focus of the argument. It's not really, what a single administration can do, what individual inroads that can be made in a particular administration, because the big lesson of the Obama administration is that irrespective of the inroads that can be made under the Obama administration, the Trump administration could come along, and a lot of the gains that were seen as institutionalized in the Obama administration, the wheels could come off on those, right? A lot of the strategic and comprehensive partnerships that were reached under the Obama administration, we saw some receding under the Trump administration. Diplomatic engagement was very uneven during the Trump administration, and even economic commitment. Southeast Asian countries had to get used to confronting the United States on bilateral trade tensions that they had, rather than sort of a strategic approach where the United States was looking to provide public goods to Southeast Asia, economically speaking, right? So that's really where the argument sort of departs. And I think the structural challenges are still there. U.S. resource constraints are real. The reality of the fact that there's a domestic environment in Washington that's focused on China and an increased threat from China. And the reality that if you have a China-focused strategy, just as you had a U.S. strategy that's focused too much on the Soviet Union, can distort really what the United States stakes are in Southeast Asia, which is Southeast Asia for its own sake. A lot of domestic trends that deserve emphasis in Southeast Asia. That's still a real conversation. And also, topics like democracy, they're sort of being tinged by the sort of value-based competition between the United States and China and Southeast Asia. But the conversation around democracy and governance in Southeast Asia is very different from the conversation from a U.S. China geopolitical perspective and prism that's being had in Washington. So that creates a lot of imbalances and difficulties in how U.S. policymakers approach the region. And similarly with U.S. economic policy, we've seen a lot of good ideas. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think, is a very useful concept. Absent the United States coming back into the CPTPP and the fact that the United States is outside the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But the fact that it's taken so long for US policymakers to even roll out the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the fact that they're starting from a very like-minded perspective, which in Southeast Asia is very difficult. This is a very diverse region and a lot of not so like-minded partners in Southeast Asia. It makes it very difficult to see how this is going to be squared with the reality in Southeast Asia for US policymakers. Now, the book ends with a few recommendations about how US policymakers, not just Biden administration, can sort of transcend these commitment challenges. And I'll just go through two or three of them because I definitely want to leave time for discussion. One is, the most simple one is sustain increased US commitments to Southeast Asia and try to raise the floor of US commitment. And actually, a lot of Biden administration officials that are in the administration and used to be outside the administration, like Kurt Campbell, have talked about a lot of these things. Developing strategic partnerships, comprehensive partnerships, ministerial dialogues that actually make it very difficult for future administrations to withdraw, right? And that's going to be something that's very difficult for the Biden administration to actually implement and sustain. But to the extent that they are able to do that, those create more enduring commitments that can last beyond the administration. They're much more important, at least for the sake of this argument, than holding a occasional sort of US ASEAN summit, right? Because the key is to bind future administrations to commitments rather than making offhand sort of symbolic declarations of US commitment in one administration. The other thing is moderating perceptions on regional imbalances. And I would say the administration has done a decent job of this with respect to the Quad, for example, which has evolved more as a mechanism that is providing public goods. The conversation around the Quad 3 or 4 years ago was around how geopolitical is this? Is this about China? Is this not about China? I very much think that we're past that conversation. I mean, the Quad has working groups that are looking at vaccinations and dealing with COVID-19, emerging technologies. These are very significant conversations that are important for all Southeast Asian countries, not just some of them. And so to the extent that the Quad can continue to do that, that's very significant. On the other hand, AUKUS, the sort of mechanism, a trilateral mechanism between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, when it was announced not in terms of what these three countries were doing in the region already, but it was announced as very much a standalone sort of security arrangement. And I think at least the regional perception in Southeast Asia, if you look at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies surveys and polling, it's still very much seen as a geopolitical concept that is somehow acting upon Southeast Asia rather than involving Southeast Asia. And I think the way to talk about it is to actually talk about what all of these three countries are doing in Southeast Asia, which is actually quite significant, not just on the security front, on the economic front, on the diplomatic front. But that conversation is really clouded out by AUKUS as a security mechanism for its own sake. And then finally, I'll just say one other thing. Calibrating threat perceptions is going to be extremely important. I don't think that all the administrations, irrespective of their sort of focus on Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, they're always going to face some kind of crisis around the world. I mean, for the Obama administration, there were a number of those. Syria was one of them. The Biden administration is now facing them with Russia and Ukraine. The Bush administration had the September 11 attacks. So it's going to be very difficult for the administration to avoid it. But I would just say it's going to be very important for the Biden administration to message that the sense of threat hierarchy, there may be various threats that the United States is facing, but the Indo-Pacific is the key theater and the United States needs to focus on that primarily. That's going to be really important for US policymakers to confront. And I think the Biden administration is starting to do that with signaling that the Quad leaders meeting that was held virtually, for example, the fact that Antony Blinken and a few other officials are making visits to the Indo-Pacific, in spite of the fact that the Russia-Ukraine crisis is going on, is important. But that's going to keep being a question. The U.S. ASEAN Summit and whether it's held as is, the travel that the Biden administration and President Biden himself makes to Southeast Asia later this year for the round of ASEAN Summitry that Titinan correctly referenced, all of these things are going to be seen as markers of U.S. commitment, fairly or unfairly. So U.S. policymakers need to keep that sense of threat perception in mind, alongside the resource constraints issue, which is going to be an issue for every administration, but I definitely think for the Biden administration, considering all the challenges it faces on COVID-19, the sort of inheritance from the Trump administration, political polarization, it's going to be very important for the Biden administration as we're heading into the midterms and then into the sort of 2024 election to kind of message that irrespective of constraints, and constraints are real and they're understandable, the Biden administration needs to signal that it's going to be able to sort of live with a certain amount of U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia that's sustainable not only for the next few years, but going into the next administration as well. And one way to think about it, it's a very crude way of thinking about it, is if the Obama administration and what we're seeing under the Biden administration is perhaps on the positive side of what we can expect from U.S. commitment, what does a sort of drop off of U.S. commitment look like under a future administration? And how do we create a floor around it to make sure that U.S. commitment doesn't decline to a degree that we're back to where we were after the Obama administration, which is, whether U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia, are we going to see decreases in economic commitment? Are we going to see decreases in U.S. security commitment, and so on and so forth? And I think that's going to be, very much, no matter what the Biden administration says, it's going to hinge on what it does. And that's going to be resourcing on the U.S. defense budget. It's going to be resourcing on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. A lot of the commitments that were made in the U.S. ASEAN Summit last year, over $100 million of new U.S. commitments that were made across the U.S. Futures Initiative. How is that going to be sustained? How is that going to actually be calibrated with resource constraints that the U.S. has domestically? So I'll stop there and look forward to comments and our discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Prashanth. Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, I'll just tell our viewers that he's one of the most prolific authors on Southeast Asia, ASEAN regional affairs. He's based as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and also a senior columnist with the Diplomat magazine. And I think all of us know the Diplomat. Prashanth, I think that's a very comprehensive outline and overview of your book. I think I like the different chapters, how you kind of dichotomize and delineate the Vietnam era, post-Vietnam, post-Cold War, 9/11, and then the global financial crisis, the broad trajectory of U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. And my takeaway from having heard your presentation, and also looking at your structure and some contents of your book, I'll ask, and I'm going to go to Dr. Van Jackson in just a minute. Is there any regions that the U.S. has has struck a right balance of commitments? I mean, so the question is, are these balance commitments, commitments balance are unbalanced everywhere? I mean, any region that the U.S. really has it in the right tone, the right mix, right? It's a big question because, commitment is one thing. Around here, we look at the U.S. in terms of credibility, the reliability. And the reliability for partners and allies is critical. And I think this has implications even for the Russia war in the Ukraine. I mean, partly, some of the views going around is that perhaps President Putin see the U.S. as being weak, unable to really commit, and therefore partners and allies and friends see U.S. as not so reliable. and not so reliable, meaning that they have to seek recourse and security maintenance elsewhere. And if they don't, then they become vulnerable. And perhaps maybe we can engage on this topic a little bit about U.S. Commitments, one thing I think, but also reliability and perceptions of weakness. I mean, I know you have, your framework is very kind of elegantly structured around power shifts and then threat perceptions, domestic resources, and above all, domestic politics, but maybe also a little bit about perceptions from the other side, from partners and allies. Dr. Van Jackson is a senior lecturer in international relations at Victoria University of Wellington. He also holds policy research appointments as Distinguished Fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Defense and Strategy Fellow with the Center for Strategic Studies in Wellington at the University of Victoria, and Senior Associate Fellow with the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. He's written and published widely and very well known on regional affairs, on Asian policy matters. And he's kindly agreed to serve as a discussant for us this morning, I think, or in the afternoon there in Wellington. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. What are some of your takeaways? Maybe, we can turn this into a little bit of a broader discussion, not just U.S. and Southeast Asia, of course, that's first and foremost, but even the U.S. in the world more broadly. Dr. Jackson.
Yes, thank you. And, thank you for hosting this event. Prashanth and I actually go a long way back. So this is a reunion of sorts. And the book, I thought, is really smart. The balance of commitment concept is a really smart concept. And it's true that the U.S., or at least I think, the U.S. views Southeast Asia and has always viewed Southeast Asia not in terms not on its own terms, but in terms of like a lot of different external factors. And it's kind of tragic, but there's a way in which Southeast Asia is a little bit like an object to U.S. policymakers. Like it's a site for the pursuit of the interests of the day. And the meaning assigned to that object, how you look at the site, the interests pursued on any given day, well, that really depends on what else is going on. And I thought Prashanth's book kind of captured that inherently, the way he structured the timeline of these stories. And one of the virtues of regional experts, various studies, specialists, right? It's having this finely calibrated sensitivity to what America's interests are in the region and what Southeast Asia's interests are and how those might match, right? And how they might be advanced, how they might be threatened or at risk. And so Prashanth's innovation here to me is to simplify the complexity of looking at a region into a handful of factors, right? So the notion of a balance of commitment works for two different audiences. Like for policymakers who are not very dialed into the inner workings of Southeast Asia, the balance of commitment tells us what's likely to be the most important to the outside great power. And then for regional experts who have kind of mastered the details of Southeast Asian political life, Prashanth's framework is a way to distill kind of their own expertise down to a handful of things that policymakers tend to care most about. And I also love the book because, it really addresses itself to one of the most persistent, even pernicious features of Asian security, which is uncertainty, right? And since 2016, the U.S. has become by a mile Asia's most volatile actor, especially in the sense of structural trends long term, And that's really problematic because for a lot of the past 30 years or so, maybe more, the U.S. has been in a position of regional primacy. And I don't think we're there anymore, but when you have the like central actor to regional life being schizophrenic, like that's a huge problem for everybody, you know. Um, and so anything that helps us navigate this new uncertainty, especially when it comes to the U.S., that should be welcomed. And I feel like Prashanth's book does that. Having said all of that, I have some questions for Prashanth that I feel like are probably going to provoke a little bit, but that's by design. So, like some friendly provocation. Um, One big question I have is whether you have thought about how this balance of commitment framework might be applicable to all great power relations with Southeast Asia. Like, to what extent could this also be stretched to apply to explain Sino Southeast Asian relations, right? Or at least since the end of the Cold War. And then a second question kind of has to do with implicit bias, and I don't mean this in a negative way. Like, I just mean there's or a subtext that U.S. commitment is a good thing, or higher levels of commitment are a good thing, and you don't you didn't specifically say that anywhere that I remember, but it was implied in a lot of places, and it struck me that, like, well, of course the region is so diverse that it can't be true that a higher level of commitment is always good for everybody, right? Um, and then there's this well-known history of like massive American violence in Southeast Asia, right, during the Cold War, but also to some extent during the War on Terror too. And so the second question is, like, how do you think America's commitment to Southeast Asia affects Southeast Asia? Like, is a higher level of commitment actually a good thing? Would the answer be different if we're talking about Southeast Asian governments versus Southeast Asian people or civil society, right? And then my third question, I only got four. What is high levels of US engagement worth to Southeast Asian policymakers? So the book clearly presents engagement as a positive thing. I think we all think that engagement is a positive thing or it's virtuous. But then I think about the Trump era, right? And the Trump administration, they showed up a lot in Southeast Asia. They were reasonably engaged. If you measure engagement based on attendance, showing up to meetings, you know, but their messaging was all about currency revaluations, right? Trade imbalances. They used the phrase reciprocity, quote unquote, which was a code word for rent seeking from smaller powers, right? It was kind of like a predatory economic approach, you know. The U.S. kind of was like a bullying presence, and the only real offset to that was that certain Southeast Asian governments simultaneously worried about China, like for similar reasons, in fact. And so I wonder what you make of all that. Like, is there something about just showing up by itself that's valuable to Southeast Asia, even if the messages that we bring when we do show up, um, it's trying to tell Southeast Asia to do things they don't want to do, right? Is the engagement still worthwhile anyway, from the Southeast Asian perspective? And then finally, the fourth question has to do with today. And this goes a little bit beyond your book, but I'm just curious. When Southeast Asian elites look at the Biden administration, how much does military or security commitment matter compared to economic commitment? And how fungible are these different domains, the security and the economic? So, like, I've written a lot recently about how the Biden administration, I don't think they have an economic vision. I think the framework, from what I can tell, is like ideologically hollow, you know? There's no story to tell beyond neoliberal free trade and coercive sanctions, neither of which is very popular anymore, and neither of which really shows evidence of what you might call like leadership, you know? So I wonder about whether Southeast Asians think America's economic deficiencies can be offset by military commitments, or more importantly, the opposite. Like, whether a more competent and visionary economic statecraft can offset military changes, military commitments. And the reason I ask this is because I've seen polling 2 consecutive years from the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies showing that the region's overwhelming priorities are COVID recovery, economic development, inequality reduction, climate change, climate adaptation, right? So there are concerns about China, but not only is the China concern a lower priority than the other issues, the surveys also indicate that the region is like much more worried about getting caught up in the middle of Sino-US great power competition. They're more worried about that even than they are worried about China. And so I've put a lot out there. I don't even know if you can remember all the stuff I just asked you, but like a bunch of tough questions. One, does the balance of commitment concept, can it be applied to Sino-Southeast Asian relations? Would it have to change somehow? 2, do you think high levels of US commitment is a good thing for the region? 3, do Southeast Asian elites value US engagement regardless of what the content of the policy is? And then 4, how do you see the relationship between security and economics in the region? So that with that, I'll just turn it back to you. But I just want to reiterate that this is one of the best things I've read on Southeast Asia in a while. And I think it's especially useful for policymakers. So, well done.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. I'll just, if I may, reinforce a couple of questions that were raised by Dr. Jackson about the balance of commitments from Beijing. If you can apply this kind of framework to China, do the Chinese have a better balance of commitments? And also the trade-off, or the what Dr. Jackson called offset pattern from the ICES surveys. One pattern is very clear that Southeast Asia and the broader regions want to rely more on trade investment, the economic relationships with China. That's undeniable. But on security maintenance, on the security side, I think there's more reliance, or I think maybe inclination towards the United States as a counterbalance. That seems to be the pattern that has emerged over the last several years. Well, there's a few questions for you, Prashanth. Maybe you can entertain them for the next few minutes, and then I want to broaden the discussion a little bit. We also have viewers, and including some students and other diplomats and so on, and they might have questions. So please go ahead, Prashanth.
Thanks, and thank you both for the great set of questions, and also very challenging ones. It's great for the discussion. I think just to answer in order of the way that the questions were posed, I think Titinan's question about is there a particular region where the United States is doing a really good job, or as good of a job it can do relative to Southeast Asia is a really good one. Because I think one of the things when I started this project that I got sort of a little bit of a nudge to do was, rather than just focus on Southeast Asia and sort of interview policymakers from the US and Southeast Asia and try to do this only as Southeast Asia, was why don't you compare it with a few other regions, right? Compare it to Northeast Asia, Europe, and maybe Latin America, for example, and see, what are the effects based on geography, based on the maturity of the relationships, and then based on within Asia, is it really true that Southeast Asia gets a short shrift relative to Northeast Asia? And I think it's definitely not the path that I pursued with the book, but I think it's a very interesting conversation. I would say just a couple of things that strike me as being very interesting by way of relative comparison. I think one is on Europe, the commitment, sort of the nature of commitments and also the sequencing of commitments is really interesting. So if you look at the nature of the relationships, whether you look at NATO, you look at the strength of the relationships, the enduring nature of, say, the fact that the US officials are also much more familiar with Europe and more familiar with Northeast Asia even than they are with Southeast Asia, that definitely sticks out. because it affects the biases within the U.S. policymaking process and also the diplomatic institutions. The other thing to note is the calendar. The calendar for U.S. policy and foreign policy is such that the summitry for Southeast Asia is located towards the end of the year, whereas for Europe, it's towards the first half of the year. And so there is a natural sort of tendency with, again, irrespective of any administration coming through, the notion, first of all, you have a multi sort of series of conversations, right? First is, how much does foreign policy matter? And then when policymakers engage Europe, oh, it's too much on Europe. How much does Asia matter? And then when policymakers go to Northeast Asia, the question is, well, Northeast Asia matters, but how much does Southeast Asia matter, right? The calendar is I think, a really important part of the conversation. And one of the recommendations in the book is that a lot of the sort of conversations around the diplomatic calendar shape narrative, and they have a really important influence. One example with respect to Southeast Asia is the fact that, you have the Shangri-La dialogue in June, usually, that happens in Singapore. And usually the summitry where you see U.S. diplomatic engagement and economic engagement is towards the latter half of the year. So essentially what you have is the Shangri-La dialogue, where you have the United States talking about security commitment, when really the reassurance has to be done more on the diplomatic and economic side. And either the sort of U.S. defense official tries to talk about U.S. policy comprehensively, but doesn't sound very credible because it's coming from the Pentagon, or it's a more defense-focused set of initiatives that then U.S. policy has to react afterwards to sort of say, no, it's not only about security, it's also about diplomacy and economics. So that is actually a really important consideration. I would say the other example is Latin America, which is a cautionary example in that regard. So even though the perception sometimes is that, for China, for example, if you could see China and Southeast Asia being its backyard, the United States and Latin America, there's often comparisons made to the Monroe Doctrine, and so on and so forth. The very humbling notion is the fact that if you look at these imbalances, so one of the imbalances is between bilateral and multilateral arrangements. Another one is between security and economic arrangements. These issues are very much still at play in U.S.-Latin America relations, right? So in the Trump administration, the USMCA that was renegotiated as a trade agreement was very much in a similar vein as to what we're talking about now with respect to reconfiguration on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, RCEP, and TPP. So it's a cautionary example, I say, that it doesn't mean that if you're located very close to your neighbors, you kind of have that balance right because it's much easier to travel diplomatically, right? Or because you're located closer, you understand the language better, and so on and so forth. No, actually, it's very challenging to get that balance right. So I would say, in sum, on the first question, the balance is very difficult to do, irrespective of each of the administrations, and that's why the elusive balances concept is very important. The balances may be elusive, but striving for at least some kind of configuration or some kind of balance or calibration is important. So to get to Van's very good questions, I would say on the United States relative to China and other countries, I would say because China's commitment to Southeast Asia in a very contemporary sense is more recent, it's a good question, but I would say it's much tougher to measure because let's say China's security commitments in Southeast Asia, China's security role is still evolving. Whereas on the diplomatic and economic side, I would say, it's in fact matching up quite well, if not much more so than the United States. So one of the comments I got in the book in the initial iteration was to ask, so if a Chinese official were to travel to Laos or travel to Cambodia versus a US official who would do the same trip, should we discount the China's official's role because China is so close to Laos and so close to Cambodia relative to the United States, right? Same thing with economic commitments. You can build a bridge, between China and Laos. You can't really build a bridge between Laos and the United States, right? Geographically speaking, right? So how do we, if we compare it to different powers, I suspect that there would have to be some kind of discounting mechanism that would account for the fact that different powers have different strengths and weaknesses relative to other powers. I would say the two powers that I see, where this framework could apply more significantly would be Japan and Australia. Japan only because it used to be thought of maybe as a more sort of economic diplomatic power, but Japan has actually done a lot on the security side, maybe quietly, but they've started being more vocal about that. So in terms of a comprehensive understanding, that's an interesting example. And also the Japanese have done a lot actually to engage smaller Southeast Asian countries like Timor and Brunei. So the balance of individual Southeast Asian countries, whereas the United States, I think, is still finding its way in terms of the balance of commitments within Southeast Asian countries. And the other one is Australia, which has sort of done a lot, I think, in the last few years to raise its overall game in Southeast Asia. I would say I will answer the sort of two questions on, is higher level of commitment a good thing? And what does it mean for policymakers in terms of a higher level of US commitment? I think those are both excellent questions. The book kind of starts off with a conversation that I had with the late ASEAN Secretary General Rodolfo Severino, who actually asked me the same question when I sort of said, I'm doing a book on US commitment in Southeast Asia and I'd like to interview you. His first question was, well, are you going to just assume that commitment and increased commitment is a good thing? Or are you also going to ask the question of, what is this commitment about? Because the US was very involved in the Vietnam War, but that was not a good thing for some of the countries in Southeast Asia. So what kind of commitment is a really important question. So the book hedges the question a little bit by saying you should talk about levels of commitment and distribution of commitment, right? And so you get sort of any country, including the United States, would say if you get an increased level of commitment, that's a good thing, irrespective of, because you're engaging and you're getting the conversation out there. But then the distribution of commitment is where you get into the questions of what are you engaging about and how are you assessing this with respect to Southeast Asia concerns. The reason why it hedges is it doesn't say what the weighting should be, right? I suspect that in Southeast Asia, the weighting would be more on the distribution of commitment rather than just on the level of commitment, which is something that maybe on certain things like alliances and partnerships can be taken for granted. But the question is really, you can engage on alliances and partnerships from a very rent-seeking perspective rather than an order-building perspective. And that is, as Van correctly said, that's the difference that you saw in the Obama administration, say, relative to the Trump administration. So one quick comment on the Biden administration and security and economics. I think this is actually a really fascinating topic, because I think 10 or 15 years ago, you could sort of have this conversation around, and I think there were overt sort of conceptualizations around this, that the United States is the security player and China is the economic player. And if you look at the IC surveys, as I think you both have noted, very granular perceptions there, China is already perceived as being not just the largest and most influential economic player, it's already perceived as being the largest political and security player as well, right? And similarly with the United States, both the United States and China are playing catch up. So China is trying to increase its security partnerships in the region because it already has sort of the economic game, and it's continuing to increase that and leverage that. The United States is a security player, but it's lagging behind on the economic game, and it's trying to step up in that sense as well. So I suspect, to answer Van's question, you have a much more contested series of interplays with respect to the economic and security conversation. And I think we are moving well beyond this notion of just China being an economic player and the United States being a security player. I think the notion of a sort of strategic partnership and a comprehensive partnership relies on a more sort of comprehensive series of measures for both the United States and China and other powers in the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Prashanth, I'm just going to convey a little bit about sentiments on the ground, from a Southeast Asia perspective, and based on your division of the different chapters in the book. So from my vantage point, and we tend to see from Southeast Asia, certainly where I'm based, the U.S. has had a tendency to go all in and then go away, and then come back all in again, and they kind of go away. They don't leave forever. It's just the attention turns elsewhere. And I think geography has a lot to do with it. I think the U.S. certainly interests are very diverse, divergent, and different regions. It's the nature of being a global superpower. But this is the feeling we get. So, for example, Vietnam to the U.S. was at its time, at its peak, was existential. It was everything for the U.S. foreign policy. Had a lot on the lines back in the 60s. And then when it concluded for the U.S. and the U.S. left, it was kind of they just tune out and turn off for years, right? So that was a kind of good way for you to have that chapter. The post-Vietnam continued to an extent in the 1980s with the Reagan Doctrine. Reagan Doctrine being applicable in Cambodia, and then I think Angola, Nicaragua. But in Cambodia, the U.S. was engaged certainly with the anti-Vietnamese, rebel movements. There were three of them at that time: the Sihanouk, led by Sihanouk, and then Son Sann, and then Khmer Rouge. So somewhat engaged in the 1980s, and then 1990s was a period of prosperity in a way for Southeast Asia. So there was APEC really coming on strong, and then the big bump on the road was the Asian financial crisis, and that one I think could receive a little bit more attention, because I think it left an indelible mark in Southeast Asian, certainly Indonesia, Thailand, perceptions of U.S. commitment and engagement and goodwill. So that took several years to transpire, the aftermath. And then you had the 9/11 phase. And of course, the U.S. had to retaliate, and we had the U.S. wars into Afghanistan and then Iraq. So Southeast Asia at that time, the U.S. back in again as a kind of a second front, right? Because the largest Muslim country being Indonesia, and there were terrorist expansionism, Al Qaeda and Jemaah Islamiyah. So the U.S. is back in again, but it was all within the GWOT, Global War on Terror, context and framework. Now, after that dissipated, subsided, you had kind of a new phase, and I think ASEAN's reaction partly was to kind of retake the initiative with the, partly East Asia Summit grew out of that, and all the other acronyms, and I think ASEAN wanted to get out of this GWOT at that time. And I'll just ask you too, why do you use Southeast Asia in your title and not ASEAN? Why the focus on Southeast Asia and not ASEAN? I know they overlap and they're interchangeable, but they're also distinctive. So just to finish off this trajectory of the ups and downs of the U.S. engagements and commitments, and then you had the 2010s under President Obama, very promising, right? And almost the pivot from the Atlantic to Pacific, and after Obama to the Indo-Pacific, and now you're going back all the way around the world, back to the Atlantic again in a way, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is what we feel and see around here, is that the U.S. has a tendency to kind of come in and have a big project, big reaction, big engagement, and then they kind of lose attention, partly due to domestic reasons and interest elsewhere, and then they kind of go away a bit, and then they kind of find a way to come back in on some other theme and contours. So this, to me, on the ground, is the lack of the balance. Now, we did some contrast with China. So China, to us here, they have the staying power is much in contrast. The staying power, the attention span, and more than that, the way they do it. For example, you have this book launch, right? And this wider discussion with two, you guys experts on Southeast Asia, Asian affairs more broadly. And we have a kind of an open culture, academic culture. We talk about the pluses and minuses and strengths and weaknesses of U.S. engagements. In China, I'm not sure if they do that. They just have engagements, and they follow through. They have guidelines, and so Belt and Road, for example, it gives them very clear footprints and guidance and compass, and they kind of follow through in Southeast Asia as on a needs base, on issues base certainly, but also a more overarching basis as well. And we can see this with the, not just visits, but the different projects, BRI projects in different countries, and the different announcements in Beijing. They don't take their eyes off the ball in Southeast Asia. They have different interests. They have other regions as well. But the sentiment here is that they have the attention span is never off, although it can span elsewhere. And I think partly they don't engage everywhere. So that's just my observation on the contrast between the two. And I also have to add that perhaps this could also receive more attention. The U.S. misadventure has been very costly. So, for example, the Iraq War, on the very questionable grounds, and this is something not to sweep under the carpet, under the rug. It has to be addressed frontally. The U.S. has also shot itself in the foot on a number of issues, and I think that's weakened its position. So maybe I'll just turn this a little bit to Dr. Van Jackson. Would you have a reaction to at this time?
To America shooting itself in the foot, yes, they do, quite often, unfortunately. Yeah, you can't take the strategic competency of the United States for granted. U.S. strategic judgment, the quality of it varies a lot, and I think especially now that we're entering into a new, I don't know if you want to call it a new distribution of power or like post-hegemony period or however you want to characterize the change to the system. It's a period of like flux and greater uncertainty, and the United States is no better equipped to navigate it or to evaluate it than anybody else, frankly. And we see that with some questionable decisions in the Trump era, but then even now, the Biden administration, and even though I've friends who serve in the administration, politically, that's my general alignment, but they're ideologically listless. They don't have a real orientation other than this reflex toward competition with China, So if you're Southeast Asia, I mean, I would be wary of that. And that was why I asked the question about to what extent is U.S. higher commitment a good or a public good, because it can go disastrously sometimes. The one thing Titinan mentioned that is I'm curious about too is like the question of reliability from the beginning of the talk. I have a sense that, and certainly I used to be a U.S. policymaker, right, before becoming a scholar. And I have a sense that U.S. officials do not believe there is any price to be paid for neglect of commitments or to reduce like the United States can reduce its commitment to Southeast Asia at any time for any reason, and it feels like there's really no price to be paid. And I wonder if that's actually an accurate, maybe I'm misrepresenting US perceptions. I think that's correct. If I'm correct, is the assessment correct? Like, do you think that there is no great price to be paid by great power and neglect? Or what is the price? Because it would be worth discovering and identifying that to US policymakers, if so, So that's kind of a question to both of you.
Certainly, I was just a quick answer. There is a price, certainly, and it's not easily quantifiable, but in terms of perceptions, I mentioned the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis. If you were to do a study of Thai-US relations, I think that would be really one point of departure, because bilateral relations from 97, I think have really been rocky. And if you do a survey in Thailand, for example, a lot of people still remember that the U.S. took not only just taking its eye off the ball, but abandoned Thailand at in its hour of need. And Thailand had before that the perception that we're a treaty ally, and through thick and thin, the Cold War and all of that. That was a really rude wake-up call for Thai perceptions of U.S.-Thai treaty alliance. So certainly there are costs. I'm not sure these costs are registered in Washington. I would agree with you, Van, that perhaps underestimated, if not neglected or ignored altogether in Washington. They just move from place to place, policy to policy, and whatever the costs to the lack of commitment perceived locally, they might not really appreciate that fully. Prashant, maybe you have a reaction to that.
Well, I can't say I disagree with what you both have said. I mean, I think it's a huge problem. I think the conversation we had earlier about the Obama administration onto the Trump administration and the Biden administration is a good one to talk about costs, right? Costs of drop-offs and commitment. Because I think in one of the interviews that I did, one Southeast Asian policymaker kind of put it this way, which is there's almost like a double series of costs that U.S. policymakers incur when they set the table and then they withdraw, right? So one part of the cost is to the United States in general, which is, for example, on TPP, you're setting the rules of the road, and then you're withdrawing, and so the rest of the region can take advantage of it with the help of Japan and the CPTPP, and the United States is not part of it. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is that when the United States accelerates its engagement, it does so with its allies and partners. And because it's a significant actor, other countries will then increase their engagement in response. And when the United States withdraws or drops its commitment out, it loses even more because other countries are seeing that there's traction for this and they're increasing their own commitment. And so when then the next administration enters into the fore after a 4 or 5 year hiatus, the region has changed. And I think that's where the Biden administration finds itself now, right? So it's great that the Biden administration is talking about the U.S. Asean Summit. It's talking about increasing the U.S. strategic partnership. But along the way, I mean, last year ASEAN just elevated its relationship with Australia and China both to a comprehensive strategic partnership. China is could criticize what China is doing on a number of other fronts, but Chinese diplomats are talking very differently from how they've talked 5 or 6 years ago, talking much more about people-to-people relations, promoting cultural interactions. You can discount that, but I think that when the United States sets the table on competition, what the Obama administration did with opening a new U.S. mission to ASEAN, a lot of other countries then followed suit, and so that gain that was seen in U.S. commitment 5 years ago, when you come back in and engage as a new administration, the bar is actually much higher for a new administration to be involved. So I would say that on commitment costs. And then the other thing about the United States shooting itself in the foot is, one of the things that the book talks about is on this issue of resource constraints and bureaucratic rivalries. You're seeing this a little bit with the Indo-Pacific economic concept, just to give a contemporary case. Even before this concept is being rolled out, there's a lot of issues about Washington, rivalries between, the USTR and Commerce and the White House and all of that. And similar thing happened with respect to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I know that in Washington, that there's a tendency to say, oh, this is very important, we need to focus on it. But in reality, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if you look at it now or 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, the big picture story is that the United States withdrew from the TPP. It's not there was, tensions in Congress and, the USTR said this and Obama did this and, so the inside conversation in Washington about these policy initiatives and what is happening versus the conversation in the region, I think there's often a discrepancy between that. And I think U.S. And Southeast Asian policymakers have talked about this. I think Bilahari Kausikan, for example, from Singapore, has talked about how, when Washington talks about the inside game, about, the different bureaucratic rivalries and so on and so forth, that's very much besides the point because the public narrative in Southeast Asia tends to move on. I mean, it's the net aggregate effect. It's not what is happening here in this minute detail on X day versus Y month versus this year.
Okay, I'm just gonna, in the last 15 minutes or so, I'm just gonna turn to a few issues here, and then we'll have a go at it. First, I'll just add a little bit to Dr. Van Jackson's earlier observation about the Trump administration. President Trump, very controversial, and I know there's a lot of very, very polarizing figure. But from perceptions on the ground here, it's also mixed. But I would say largely that U.S. Reliability was a big question mark, of course, because President Trump, really picked and chose, and he was very selective how to engage, when to engage. But the U.S. credibility, ability to kind of deliver once it chose a course of action, was actually registered in many capitals around here. So, for example, on a North Korean issue, on China, it was very controversial and very tense with the confrontation. But if you look at the effects, it has some results. So I'll just add that in. But now I'd like to turn to three issues. The role of allies. So Australia, you mentioned, Prashanth, that has been more assertive, and I think we can really feel it here. And in Thailand, in mainland Southeast Asia, even in Australia, DFAT programs are on the rise, and they really are, not just talking a bigger game, but also acting on it and delivering. But maybe also Japan, I think, is also another major U.S. ally that's been doing a lot and wanting to do more, and very concerned about the geopolitical mix and China's assertiveness. But maybe, what about working with more of these allies where the U.S. is unprepared or perhaps lacking the resources to fully engage? So role of allies. Then your book, the recommendation I find insightful and instructive is this idea of institutionalizing continuity. You go from administration to administration, from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. I mean, really up and down. But if there are ways to set up mechanisms and channels to promote and ensure some continuity among these, policy platforms across administrations. And one way, politicians are very polarized, the two main parties there. But I was wondering if the policy community below the administration, a lot of the think tanks, a lot of the like-minded academics and so on, if there could be at least some kind of consensus, some kind of continuity that can be promoted and affected in that community. But this idea about institutionalizing continuity is very instructive. And finally, what do we say, from our discussion about Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And the U.S. very much engaged there, of course, up to a point. President Biden made it very clear that there will be no U.S. troops on the ground. And I think NATO also made some arguments along the same lines. But this is a big test, in my view, now of U.S. reliability, credibility, and commitments as well. So maybe if it doesn't come out of it well, the U.S. is seen as weak, and then Russia has its way. This will be a big lesson to a lot of countries. Maybe we'll go to Dr. Jackson Van. Anything from you, and then we'll wrap up with Prashanth's last words. Dr. Van Jackson.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like the Ukraine crisis right now it's just almost as long as we don't have nuclear war, we're just going to continue with larger structural trends as they are. And one of those, like when it comes to Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, one of those is that China has, I'm going to state it like a caricature on purpose, but China has established economic hegemony in Asia, right, at America's expense, partly because of American economic policy. For example, the role that America played in setting up Thailand to fail in the Asian financial crisis. It's loose capital controls that U.S. and through the IMF in particular imposed that made it possible for the crisis to trigger in the first place. And then in response to the Asian financial crisis, ASEAN and Southeast Asian governments and Northeast Asian governments, because they were also affected by this, right? They all created institutional architecture and financial monitoring architecture and intra-regional balance of payments agreements and all this stuff. All of these things that cut out the United States from the economic life of Asia. Obviously, the United States is still very important economically, but over time, since that point, since particularly the Asian financial crisis, China has occupied that space more and more. And we are all interdependent in a way. American market is where finished goods from China go, right? But China has positioned itself as literally the center of that flow of the global supply chain of products that end up in the American market. And it's able to leverage that for political influence through things like strategic comprehensive partnerships. So China has established itself as basically like an economic hegemon. America's value proposition is as like a security provider in a sense, but it was like, I think both of you had mentioned, China is starting to occupy that role a little bit too. There's definitely contest there, you know? So America structurally, in terms of trends, it's at a disadvantage, and, you know, future favors China is kind of how it looks for Asia. And so Ukraine, the fact that we get distracted by stuff like that, just show like the fact that we have global interests, it kind of suggests that like these regional trends in Asia are going to continue playing themselves out. There's no if we're distracted by Ukraine, and that means that we are not able to focus on Asia as much, and China is already economic hegemon in Asia, it's only going to be more so, you know? So like, I don't know how much it matters how we respond to the Ukraine crisis, as long as we don't cause nuclear war. But Asia is definitely shifting, and America is at more and more of a disadvantage, I feel like, no matter what we decide, no matter who's president.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Prashant, last words from you.
Well, thanks. I think they're good questions. All of these. I mean, I think on the work with allies, that's a really important one, because I very much think that in keeping with the theme that we all three of us have been sort of talking about, which is the U.S. basically the U.S. competitive advantage, right? In an increasing in a world where Southeast Asia's own importance is rising, but also the real story of the past 10 or 15, 20 years is that it's not the United States pivoting to Southeast Asia. It's that more and more countries are pivoting to Southeast Asia at the same time. And so the real issue for the United States is what is the competitive advantage for the United States, not today, but in 15, 20, 30, 40 years when all of these trends are continuing to happen. And that affects the alliance question that you raised, Titinan, right? So it's not just important for the United States to talk about, the United States and Japan need to cooperate on X in Southeast Asia, or the United States and South Korea. That's really important as using the architecture that the United States has of alliances and partnerships to leverage in Southeast Asia. But the big thing is that Japan, South Korea, and these other countries are also doing increasingly more in the security domain and the economic domain on their own terms. And so like the IC surveys and such are sort of looking and showing, South Korea is seen as, a big sort of technology provider in Southeast Asia on issues like 5G. It's not just a U.S. China competition game. And then the question becomes, if these allies and partners are doing their own thing in Southeast Asia, how does the United States position itself uniquely, right? So on infrastructure, that's a really good example. So one of the interviews I did with a Southeast Asian policymaker talked about U.S. China competition, and policymaker essentially said, I'm not sure what competition you're talking about with respect to the U.S. and China. On the economic side, on infrastructure, it's mostly a China-Japan competition with a number of other countries. The United States is not really in the infrastructure game. And the big takeaway point there is that competition can look differently in terms of different players for different realms, right? It's not just a sort of U.S. China or U.S. Japan, U.S. South Korea, so on and so forth. So that's, I think, is a really important point to keep in mind on the allies front. I would say on the sort of institutionalized question, it's a really good one, and it's a big challenge in Southeast Asia because there aren't actually a lot of sticky commitments that the United States has across the board. The U.S.-Thailand alliance is one. The U.S.-Philippine alliance is one. Presidential attendance at U.S. ASEAN summits is a newer one. But even that is a huge challenge for the United States and Washington to keep, right? And so the one solution is to think about what institutionalized commitments can the United States and U.S. policymakers add to Southeast Asian countries, and we're seeing the Biden administration think about that. So perhaps we should reframe the conversation about, each year, is the U.S. president going to attend the summit, the round of summitry or not, depending on what crisis is happening in the world. Perhaps we should reframe the conversation as to why don't we increase more ministerial partnerships so that more U.S. cabinet officials are involved with their Southeast Asian counterparts, irrespective of the drop off of U.S. presidential commitment year on year, which perhaps we can do very little about. But the other way to reframe that is, even if a U.S. president can't go to a round of summits, and Van knows, working in U.S. policy, these are very difficult decisions, right? In terms of where a U.S. president's going to go or not go, but make the decision early, communicate it, and say there's going to be a legitimate U.S. cabinet level official who's going to go. Unlike in the Trump administration, where by the end of the administration, Southeast Asian officials were puzzled as to why a certain official was sent in Trump's stead rather than another official, right? There was a notion that it was vice president, and then it was downgraded and then further downgraded. So there needs to be a consistent handling of these commitment questions so that it's not a headline development each year, whether the U.S. president is going or not going. And then finally on Russia and Ukraine, I mean, I think Van summed it up really well. The only thing I would add to that in terms of Russia, Ukraine is that I think there's very much a conception of, political scientists and scholars sort of debate and actually study this, right? Whether commitments transfer across regions, right? Does how the U.S. react to Russia and Ukraine or Syria, does it affect what the United States does in Asia? Was Russia emboldened by the fact that the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, and that might have been one of the reasons why it invaded Ukraine? I would say there's that conversation. But there's also the very sort of real media narrative conversation that certainly is the question, irrespective of what the reality is, right? So, I could just envision, right? We arrive at the next U.S. defense budget, and if certain line items are not, prioritized for Asia and Southeast Asia, the headline is going to write itself, which is the United States was distracted by Russia and Ukraine, as you correctly said, Titinan, right? It's a pivot to the Atlantic, right? It's a pivot away from the Pacific and away from Asia. So that's more of a sort of narrative conversation, but I think it's very much where we're at. And the second thing I would say is the U.S. China competition and the notion that the United States is seeing China as the first sphere the Russia-China relationship is taking place, we may actually see a fusion between China as being a threat to the United States or challenge to the United States, and Russia, which was seen as a second sort of tier actor, perhaps, right? We may be having a more nuanced conversation about these various tiers, right? It's not a neat tier between China and then it's Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and then it's non-traditional security threats like climate change. These are all intersecting. And I think if Ukraine has taught us anything, we should be thinking about these things more comprehensively rather than having these rigid sort of tiers, right? As difficult as it is for U.S. policymakers to do it, it's much easier for me as an analyst and scholar to sort of talk about that. But I realize it's much more difficult to implement in practice.
Okay, thank you very much. So nuances and complexities have to be ingrained much more in the policymaking processes in Washington. I want to thank both of you very much, Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, and also a pleasure to launch your book, Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy. I'm sure it will have a wide readership. Thank you very much for joining us from Washington in the late hour at night there. And then I want to thank our discussant, Dr. Van Jackson, joining us in the late afternoon from Wellington, New Zealand. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to all our viewers. Let me bring this to a close, and we'll look forward to promoting your book down the road around here in Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone.
สวัสดีครับ